The Letter That Came Home, Chapter 1, The House on Willow Lane. Eleanor Grayson sat in her rocking chair by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the living room of her small house on Willow Lane. At 72, her hands were still steady, though the lines on her face told stories of a life full of both joy and sorrow. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a relic from her marriage to Harold, gone now for nearly 15 years. She sipped her chamomile tea, her eyes drifting to the garden outside, where the roses she'd tended for decades bloomed in defiant bursts of red and pink. It was a Tuesday in September, the kind of day that felt like it could slip away unnoticed. Eleanor had spent the morning sorting through old photo albums, a task she'd taken up since retiring from her job at the library. The albums were a treasure trove of memories. Her daughter, Margaret, as a gap-toothed child, Harold in his Navy uniform, and countless Christmases with her grandchildren, Lily and Thomas. But today, the albums had stirred something else, a nagging ache she couldn't quite place. It was as if a piece of her past was calling out, demanding to be remembered. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Eleanor set her teacup down and rose slowly, her knees protesting. She wasn't expecting anyone. The neighbors, kind as they were, rarely dropped by unannounced, and her daughter lived 3 states away. She shuffled to the door, smoothing her cardigan, and opened it to find a young postal worker no older than 30, holding a small, weathered envelope. "Mrs. Grayson?" he asked, glancing at the address. "That's me," Eleanor said, her voice warm but curious. "This came through the dead letter office," he said, handing her the envelope. "It's old, really old. They found it in a sorting facility in Chicago, tucked away in some forgotten bin. Took a while to track you down." Eleanor took the envelope, her fingers brushing against its brittle, yellowed surface. Her name, Eleanor Grayson, was written in a familiar, looping script, faded but unmistakable. Her breath caught. She knew that handwriting. It was her own. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The postal worker tipped his cap and left, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway, the envelope trembling in her hands. She closed the door and returned to her rocking chair, her heart thudding. The postmark was smudged, but she could make out the year, 1973, 52 years ago. She'd been 20 years old, newly married, and living in a tiny apartment with Harold in a different city. How could a letter she'd written all those years ago end up back in her hands? She turned the envelope over. The address was to a Mrs. Clara Hensley, someone Eleanor hadn't thought of in decades. Clara had been her neighbor back then, a kind older woman who'd lived alone and loved to share stories over tea. Eleanor had written to her after moving away, promising to stay in touch. But this letter, it hadn't been sent, or had it? Her memory was foggy, blurred by time. With trembling fingers, Eleanor opened the envelope, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside was a single sheet, folded neatly, the ink faded but legible. She unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Clara, I hope this letter finds you well. Harold and I are settling into our new place, though it's smaller than I'd imagined. The city is loud, and I miss the quiet of our old street. I miss our talks too. Your stories about your travels always made me feel like I could see the world through your eyes. There's something I need to tell you, Clara, something I couldn't say before we left. It's about my sister, Rose. I know I never spoke of her much, but she's been on my mind lately. I haven't seen her in years, not since she ran away when I was 16. She was only 18 and she left without a word. My parents were heartbroken and I was angry. So angry. I blamed her for tearing our family apart. But now, I'm starting to wonder if I was wrong to judge her so harshly. I think she was running from something she couldn't face. Clara, I found a letter from Rose last week, hidden in an old box of my mother's things. It was addressed to me, but I never saw it until now. She wrote that she was sorry, that she loved me, and that she hoped one day I'd understand why she had to leave. She didn't say where she was, only that she was safe. I don't know if she's still out there, Clara, but I can't stop thinking about her. I want to find her. I want to tell her I forgive her, but I don't know where to start. I'm writing to you because you always seem to understand people, even when they didn't understand themselves. If you have any advice, I'd be so grateful. I feel like I'm holding on to a piece of my heart that's been missing for too long. Yours, always. Eleanor. Eleanor's hands shook as she set the letter down. Rose. Her sister's name felt like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years, not since her parents had passed, not since the weight of her sister's absence had settled into a quiet, permanent ache. Rose had been her best friend, her confidant, until the day she vanished without explanation. Eleanor had spent years resenting her, then years regretting that resentment. And now, this letter, a plea she'd written at 20, full of hope and desperation, had come back to her, as if the universe itself was demanding she face the past. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the ceiling. Why had this letter never reached Clara? Had she forgotten to mail it? Or had it been lost in the chaos of her early married life? And why, after all these years, had it found its way back to her? The questions swirled, each one tugging at a memory she'd buried long ago. Chapter 2. The search begins. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The letter lay on her nightstand, its presence as loud as a heartbeat. She tossed and turned, images of Rose flashing through her mind, Rose braiding her hair when they were children, Rose laughing as they ran through the fields behind their childhood home, Rose's face the last time Eleanor saw her, pale and distant, as if she were already halfway gone. By morning, Eleanor knew she couldn't ignore the letter. It wasn't just a relic, it was a call to action. She was 72, yes, but she was healthy, sharp, and stubborn as ever. If there was a chance Rose was still out there, she had to try to find her. She owed it to her sister and to herself. Over breakfast, Eleanor pulled out her laptop, a gift from her grandson Thomas, who'd insisted she needed to join the digital age. She opened a browser and hesitated. Where did one even begin to look for someone missing for over 50 years? She typed Rose Marie Thompson into the search bar, her sister's maiden name, and hit enter. The results were overwhelming. Obituaries, social media profiles, genealogy sites, none of them clearly linked to her Rose. She tried narrowing it down with their hometown, their parents' names, but still nothing definitive. Frustrated, Eleanor turned to the letter again. Clara Hensley. Maybe Clara had known something, even if the letter never reached her. Eleanor searched for Clara's name, but the results were sparse. Clara would be long gone by now, she realized, her heart sinking. But then she remembered Clara's daughter, Susan, who'd been a few years older than Eleanor. Could Susan still be alive? After hours of digging, Eleanor found a Susan Hensley Wright living in a retirement community in Florida. The age matched, and the obituary of a man listed as her husband mentioned a connection to the same city where Eleanor and Clara had been neighbors. It was a long shot, but it was something. Eleanor drafted an email, her fingers clumsy on the keyboard. "Dear Susan, I hope this message finds you well. Dear Susan, I hope this message finds you well. I hope this message finds you well. Dear Susan, I hope this message finds you well. Dear Susan, I hope this message finds you well. My name is Eleanor Grayson, and I believe we knew each other briefly many years ago when I was your mother's neighbor. I recently received an old letter I wrote to your mother in 1973, one that was never delivered. It's brought up memories of my sister, Rose, who disappeared when we were young. I'm trying to find her, or at least learn what happened to her. If you have any memories of my sister or anything your mother might have shared, I'd be so grateful to hear from you. Warm regards, Eleanor Grayson." She hit send and leaned back, her heart racing. It felt like she'd opened a door she'd kept locked for decades. Now, all she could do was wait. Chapter 3, A Voice from the Past. 3 days later, Eleanor's phone rang. She was in the kitchen kneading dough for her famous cinnamon rolls when the unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. She wiped her hands on her apron and answered. "Hello?" she said. A voice cautious. "Eleanor, it's Susan Hensley Wright." Eleanor's heart skipped. "Susan, oh, thank you for calling." Susan's voice was warm but tinged with age. "I got your email, Eleanor. I was so surprised to hear from you after all these years. I remember you and Harold, such a sweet couple, and your sister Rose. I was so sorry to hear she left." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly. "Thank you, Susan. I'm trying to find her, or at least understand what happened. Did your mother ever mention anything about her?" There was a pause, and Eleanor held her breath. "You know, my mother did say something once," Susan said slowly. "It was years after you moved away. She said she'd heard from a friend that Rose had been seen in San Francisco back in the late 60s. Something about her living with a group of artists, or maybe a commune. But that was just a rumor, and Mother wasn't sure it was true. San Francisco." The words hit Eleanor like a wave. It was a lead, however faint. Did she say anything else? Anything at all? "I'm afraid not," Susan said. "But I can ask my cousins if they know anything. And, well, I don't know if this helps, but I have some of Mother's old things in storage. There might be letters, diary, or diaries. I could look through them, if you'd like." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "That would mean the world, Susan. Thank you." After the call, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing. San Francisco in the late 60s, a time of hippies, free love, and rebellion. Could Rose have been part of that world? It wasn't hard to imagine. Rose had always been restless, drawn to art and music, chafing against their small-town life. But why hadn't she come back? What had kept her away? Chapter 4, The Journey West. Eleanor knew she couldn't do this alone. She called her daughter, Margaret, and told her everything about the letter, Rose, and the faint lead in San Francisco. Margaret, practical and protective, was skeptical. "Mom, you're talking about something that happened 50 years ago," she said. "Even if Rose was in San Francisco, she might not be there now. Or she might not be alive. I know, Eleanor said softly. But I have to try. I've carried this guilt for too long. I need to know. Margaret sighed. Okay, but you're not going alone. I'm coming with you. A week later, Eleanor and Margaret boarded a plane to San Francisco. Eleanor's heart fluttered with a mix of hope and fear. The city was vibrant, overwhelming, so different from the quiet streets of her hometown. They checked into a small hotel near the Haight-Ashbury district, the heart of the counterculture movement in the 60s. If Rose had been here, this was where she'd have been. Their first stop was the San Francisco Public Library, where they met with a local historian named Rachel, who specialized in the city's hippie era. Rachel was young, with bright eyes and an enthusiasm that reminded Eleanor of Rose. The late 60s were wild here, Rachel said, spreading out old photos and newspaper clippings. Communes, artists, musicians, people came from all over, looking for freedom. If your sister was here, she might have been part of a group like the Diggers or lived in one of the collective houses. Eleanor showed Rachel a photo of Rose, taken when she was 17. Her dark hair was long, her smile wide but shadowed. Rachel studied it, then shook her head. I don't recognize her, but there are archives we can check. Commune records, old newsletters, and there's a community center nearby where some of the old-timers still hang out. They might remember something. At the community center, Eleanor and Margaret met a man named Paul, a gray-haired artist in his late 70s. His hands were stained with paint, and his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Eleanor showed him Rose's photo, her heart in her throat. Paul studied it for a long moment. She looks familiar, he said slowly. It was a girl back then, called herself Star or something like that. Dark hair, loved to paint. She lived in a house on Lyon Street for a while. But she left, maybe 69 or 70. I don't know where she went. Eleanor's knees weakened. Star. It sounded like something Rose would choose, a name that sparkled, free from the weight of their family's expectations. Do you know anything else about her? She asked. Paul shook his head. It was a long time ago. People came and went. But you could check the Lyon Street house. It's still there, though it's a private residence now. Maybe the owners know something. Chapter 5, The House on Lyon Street. The house on Lyon Street was a faded Victorian, its once bright paint peeling but its bones sturdy. Eleanor and Margaret knocked, and a woman in her 50s answered, her expression wary. I'm sorry to bother you, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I'm looking for information about my sister who might have lived here in the late 60s. Her name was Rose Thompson, though she might have gone by Star. The woman's eyes widened slightly. Star? My grandmother used to talk about a girl named Star who lived here back then. She was an artist, right? Grandma said she was kind but sad, like she was running from something. Eleanor's heart pounded. Do you know what happened to her? The woman hesitated, then invited them inside. My grandmother kept a guest book from those days, she said. People who stayed here signed it. Let me get it. She returned with a worn leather book, its pages yellowed. Eleanor opened it, her hands trembling, and flipped through the names. There, in a bold, familiar script, was a single word. Star. Next to it, a tiny sketch of a flower. Eleanor's breath caught. It was Rose's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years. There's something else. The woman said, Grandma told me Star left suddenly, but she sent a postcard a few years later from New Mexico. I don't know if we still have it, but I can look. Eleanor thanked her, tears streaming down her face. New Mexico. Another lead. Fragile, but real. She clutched the guest book to her chest, feeling closer to Rose than she had in decades. Chapter 6: The Road to New Mexico. Eleanor and Margaret rented a car and drove to New Mexico, a journey that took them through deserts and mountains. Eleanor felt a strange peace settle over her, as if Rose's spirit was guiding them. They headed to Taos, a haven for artists even now, where Rose might have found a home. In Taos, they visited galleries, community centers, and historical societies, showing Rose's photo and asking about a woman named Star. Most people shook their heads, but at a small art co-op, an elderly woman named Maria paused. "I knew a Star," she said, her voice soft. She came here in the early 70s. She painted beautiful, haunting things. She lived alone, kept to herself. But she left in 78, I think. Said she was going north, maybe Oregon. Eleanor's heart sank and soared at once. Another move, another trail. But Rose had been alive, at least into the late 70s. Did she ever talk about her past? Eleanor asked. Maria nodded. Once, after a few glasses of wine, she said she'd hurt her family and couldn't go back. She cried when she said it. I think she carried a lot of guilt. Eleanor's chest ached. Rose had been out there, carrying the same pain Eleanor had. If only they'd found each other sooner. Chapter 7: The Final Lead. Oregon was their last hope. Eleanor and Margaret drove north, the landscape shifting to lush forests and misty coasts. They focused on artist communities, places Rose might have gravitated to. At a gallery in Portland, they met a curator named James, who recognized the style of the flower sketch from the guest book. "That looks like something Rose T. used to draw," he said. "She was a local artist here in the 80s and 90s. Older woman, kept to herself. She passed away in 2005. I'm afraid." Eleanor's knees buckled, and Margaret steadied her. Rose was gone. The weight of it was crushing, yet there was a strange relief, too. She'd lived a long life, even if it was apart from her family. "Do you know anything about her?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. James nodded. "A collection of paintings to the gallery, and there's a box of her things in storage. Journals, letters. You're welcome to look through them." Chapter 8: The Journals. The box was small, its contents carefully packed. Eleanor opened it with reverence, finding sketchbooks, photos, and a stack of journals. She began to read, her eyes blurring with tears. Rose's words were raw, honest. She wrote of her fear, her shame, her reasons for leaving, a secret she'd never shared, a trauma from their father's temper that Eleanor had been too young to understand. She wrote of her love for Eleanor, her regret for leaving her behind, and she wrote of her life, her art, her travels, the people she'd loved and lost. One entry, dated 1995, broke Eleanor's heart. "I saw a woman today who looked like Eleanor might now. Older, but with the same kind eyes. I wanted to run to her, to beg her forgiveness, but I couldn't. I don't deserve it. I hope she's happy. I hope she knows I loved her. Always." Eleanor sobbed, clutching the journal. Rose had never stopped loving her. The guilt they'd both carried could have been lifted if only they'd found each other. But in these pages, Eleanor found a kind of absolution. She forgave Rose, and she hoped Rose, wherever she was now, felt that forgiveness. Chapter 9: Coming Home. Eleanor and Margaret returned to Willow Lane, the box of Rose's things in tow, Eleanor set up a small shrine in her living room. A painting of roses, a photo, the guest book sketch. She began sharing Rose's story with her grandchildren, Lily and Thomas, ensuring her sister's memory lived on. One evening, as Eleanor sat by the window, she felt a warmth, like a presence. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I forgive you, Rose, and I love you." The grandfather clock ticked on, and for the first time in decades, Eleanor felt whole.